Chillo. I am Executive Director at Next Century Cities, and I'm just really excited about the work that we've been able to do and the work that we are thinking about doing in weeks and months to come. And the local officials that we represent are essential partners in that. When we are doing work, although we're based here in DC, there are lots of places where we engage. It's always really important for us to be able to meet people where they are. And so the point of having this conversation is to make sure that people know what's happening in both the federal and the state policy landscape, to find out a little bit of information on initiatives that you might not be aware of. And most importantly, walking away from this conversation, we hope that we are giving local officials actual pieces of information that they can actually make advocacy moves forward. So the thing is, sometimes that's going to be about engaging with regulators and policymakers. Sometimes that's going to be about building community buy-in. Sometimes that's going to be about finding the right partners to actually do some brainstorming. So wherever you are in the journey, we're really excited to have you as a part of this conversation. And we get to start this conversation with some of the biggest tech and telecom intellectual giants that I know. I'm really excited. Sometimes I do get excited when I get to meet really incredible people in this line of work. And I'm always thinking about ways that we can not only engage with them and take advantage of the research that they're doing, but finding ways for us to contribute to their thought leadership. So today we're going to get started with the conversation. I want to just one more time review, just for the sake of people who just joined, because we have about 10 people who were just added to this conversation. When you come on board into Zoom, you're going to be silenced, so it's going to be muted. So you'll have to unmute yourself to actually speak. I encourage you, raise your hand if you want to contribute something to the conversation, because that will at least alert us. And we'll go through and introduce ourselves on the line. And then, of course, we encourage you to use the chat box to make sure that you are either adding work, questions, anything that is relevant to the conversation. So I will start by just doing a couple of introductions, and we're going to start by introducing the NCC team. As I mentioned before, my name is Fellow Chillo. I am Executive Director of Next Century Cities. Ryan?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Johnston, and I am Policy Counsel with Next Century Cities.
Thanks, Ryan. Lucas?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lucas Peterzak. Some of you might know me as the Membership Manager for Next Century Cities, and I have recently transitioned into a Policy Associate for the organization.
And we are very excited to have you in that role. So next up, we're going to go ahead and start our conversation with talking a little bit about state initiatives. Earlier this year, or maybe about a year ago, I had the good fortune of being able to meet Kathryn at a conference in Texas. And what's really exciting specifically about my getting to know her is that I found out that she's even more kind than she is brilliant. So I'm really excited that we get to share in some of her research and to be a part of your ongoing dialogue to make sure that we're advancing state initiatives. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Kathryn de Wit of Pew Charitable Trusts.
This is why I always love, pitching in with Francella. She always gives you a little pep talk before you get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Kathryn de Wit. I recognize a couple names and organizations on this call, so it's nice to see all of you. It's also nice to meet those of you that I don't know. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Pew Charitable Trusts, we are a nonpartisan research organization that helps policymakers navigate challenging public policy issues. And big surprise, broadband is one of those. You probably are familiar with the research that our colleagues at the Pew Research Center have been producing for about a decade now that looks at broadband access and usage gaps across the country. My team is looking at how states are responding to the digital divide. We recognize that there was a lot of analysis on federal responses and a lot of analysis on local responses, but states have been doing quite a bit for the last decade. And we thought that it would be helpful to elevate that for state policymakers, for local leaders, for federal leaders, and for other researchers like us. So the long story short of what we found is that states are doing quite a bit. They are using 5 key activities to bridge the digital divide. Those are engaging stakeholders, establishing a policy framework, supporting state and local planning and capacity building, providing funding for deployment and operations, and then assessing their impact and using that to inform next steps. Whenever I talk to public policy professionals, I kind of feel like there's a little bit of an eye roll that comes with that explanation, because those are really just the good tenets of public policy. But we are really seeing those being employed across the country by our state broadband officers. And they're doing that in a couple different ways. But I think that one of the key things that emerged from our research is in just how states are working with localities and how they're supporting localities. State leaders realize that, broadband is challenging. They're trying to navigate this issue themselves. But they also realize that local leaders in particular, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the expertise to really work through what is a very challenging and hard problem that requires engaging a lot of different stakeholders from the public and private sectors. And so states are really trying to identify opportunities to ease those burdens on local leaders. I think really the key takeaway from all of this, before I get into some of the more specifics around this, local success really depends on the project meeting local needs. And the state-supported planning processes help localities and communities evaluate what models will work best for them. So in some cases, that is a P3, a public-private partnership. In some cases, that is fully public. In other cases, it is truly a private partnership. But where we've seen states add a lot of value is in helping communities work with their partners and in the community and in the private sector to figure out which models work best for them. But we've seen this kind of manifest itself in a couple different ways. So I talked a little bit about capacity building and planning and technical assistance. These are these things that really, again, states are using to help ease the burden on some local leaders. We're seeing that in several states, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the programs in Maine, West Virginia, North Carolina, and Colorado. So Maine, and I see Peggy Schaefer is on the call right now. Hi, Peggy. Maine's program specifically supports capacity building and planning at the local level. They often talk about the fact that this is really a local issue and it's driven and spearheaded by local leaders. And so what Maine does is actually support communities in building broadband plans, and creating broadband plans and mobilizing the people and the resources in order to make progress and position themselves for funding, whether it's from the state, for investment from private sector partners, or for federal programs. The state of West Virginia is developing a technical capacity building technical assistance model where they work with local leaders on who already work on public infrastructure to train them on technical issues related to broadband. So the idea is, folks who work on issues like water and sewer, broadband isn't that different. I mean, it is, but it isn't. So the team in West Virginia is developing toolkits to help local leaders kind of make that educational transition from traditional infrastructure to broadband. I flagged North Carolina and Colorado for 2 reasons. First is that they both have technical assistance teams that work with localities and regions to, again, help them with that broadband planning process. North Carolina has produced some really valuable content for local leaders. I would encourage you to look up the playbook that they produced with the Appalachian Regional Commission. We found it to be an incredibly useful educational tool. Provides also one of the best, overviews of key issues related to broadband as well. So they have a team of folks who operate in specific regions within the state. So they know the ins and outs of that region that they are responsible for. They understand the geography, they know the local players, they understand the providers. So they work hand in hand with community leaders in order to help position themselves for investment. Colorado, they also have a team that does that type of technical assistance, but they also have an individual whose job it is to help local leaders and providers navigate the federal funding process, which is hard and is really confusing and takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. So this woman's job is to help identify federal funding opportunities and then help their local leaders in the public and private sectors get the funding that they need in order to serve their communities. Of course, all of you are familiar as well with stakeholder engagement and how critical that is to actually making meaningful progress in this space. States are really relying on stakeholder engagement in order to, again, assess the problem and then identify the solutions that work best for their local communities. I think one really interesting example that came out of this was Wisconsin and Wisconsin's Telecommuter Forward certification program. This came as a result of a local economic development corporation saying, we'd like to certify ourselves as a spot where people can work remotely. Maybe they have a vacation home in this area. We'd like to be able to keep them here for an extra week or 2 weeks or even a couple extra days because that puts money in the economy. So do you care if we create this certification that says we have the broadband connections that you need in order to work remotely? And the state said, okay. And so now this is a statewide program that Minnesota has implemented as well. And again, that was a locally identified need, and they worked with the state in order to find a solution that would work best for them. The other interesting thing that's come out of the stakeholder engagement process, or we're increasingly seeing states on grant applications require some demonstration of community buy-in and community engagement. So in some cases, this is very formal, where there are signed letters from community members saying, we need this broadband. In other cases, it's less formal and just some type of demonstrated demand from the community that a provider says, hey, we've gone out and talked to the community. We know that they want this. We know that they need it. This is the thing that certifies it. These are seemingly small actions that actually make a really big difference. And they make a big difference in two ways. So first is, of course, the business case. So, if you are out, building excitement and demand for the service, building awareness of the service, you're going to increase the take rate. So, that helps your business case. But the other piece is that it builds these relationships that are so essential to creating sustainable broadband solutions. And time again, we heard from interviewees on the ground, and not just our state broadband officers, but the people that worked with them in communities, that said that those relationships were really the key to their success. It helped communities identify the appropriate solutions. It helped them build stronger partnerships with the private sector. It also helped identify new communities who could partner with the private sector. So again, the stakeholder engagement is really essential because it helps build the type of relationships that lead to sort of a waterfall effect.
Kathryn, before you continue, I do want to raise up a question from Rick Usher that's in the chat. And so he asked about if you're working with Missouri Broadband. I'm working with the University of Missouri system, and they're hosting a webinar on June 1st to talk about digital equity, a digital equity resource navigator. Do you have any insights on that program?
I don't have any. We do work with Missouri, with the Missouri team, but I don't have any insights on that specific program. That's really good to know that they're launching a webinar, though. I'd like to sign up for that.
Okay, we'll definitely.
But I wasn't sure. Did you have a specific question, Rick, related to that initiative, or?
No, I just wanted to make sure that they're connected. I've been working with Professor Tony Lupino at UMKC locally, and we've got a coalition for digital inclusion that's been really active for about 6 years, and I just wanted to make sure he was up to speed with what's going on. So I'll if you want to share your email address with me, then I'll forward that to him and see if he'll send you an invite to that.
Sure. It's K de Wit, KDEWIT at pewtrusts.org. plural.com or org.org.
We'll drop that in the chat.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
That's probably the more efficient way to do this.
Yeah,
Speaking of digital literacy courses, yes, we are working with Missouri. We work with Tim Arbeiter, who leads their statewide broadband program. I don't know if Rick, if you've run into him at all, but Tim has been really hitting the pavement across the state for the last 2 years. And I think they announced their first round of grant funding for deployment about a month ago.
well, okay, they're happier in the rural areas than the cities. So we're trying to bring them here though. And anyways, thanks for the answering the question quickly.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. I think the last thing that I would flag for this when we're talking about how states are working with localities, Virginia is another state that, thank you, Lucas, that they actually require a public-private partnership for their grant program. Now, I think that one of the challenges in this space is that sometimes people cringe a little bit when we talk about public-private partnerships, but what we really found from our research is that when they're done right, they really do work for communities. And they work for providers. So I think, again, it's a matter of doing them right, which changes by state, changes by community. But, you know, it's important to build those relationships with your state leaders to help elevate the challenges and concerns that are unique to you. Francella may roll her eyes or something when I say this, but like states, I really do think are the pathway to closing the digital divide. Federal leaders obviously play a really essential role, but states are one level closer to the issue. They are one level closer to working with communities. The state policy environment cannot be, we cannot overstate just how important state policy is in advancing deployment and connectivity. So for those of you who aren't engaged with your state programs, if there is one, or if you're not engaged with your state legislators, I would really encourage you to do so. And in case you need any information about your state programs, we actually have a list of those on our website. I can share that link with all of you. So for those of you who don't know who the state contact person is or whether or not your state even has a program, you can find out through that. And I'll also share a link to NTIA's resource as well. They have one too.
Kathryn, before I do want to make sure that we get a chance to have people ask questions. My
Sure.
question to you is, if you are a local official, maybe in a community where there isn't necessarily, you aren't aware of state programs, what do you do to engage from there?
So the first is figuring out whether or not there is a program. Nearly 3/4 of states have some type of program in process right now, and that ranges from state deployment initiatives to task forces that are trying to assess what the challenge looks like across the state. So I think the first thing that I would do is look and see whether or not your state has a program. And again, we can share the resources for that as well. The second piece is if there is a state program, or if there is an office or agency who is responsible for it, reach out to them. Say, this is my problem. This is what we've tried to do. How can you help? I think we heard time and time again that the best value of these state broadband officers and programs is that they actually pick up the phone. And these are those small things where, you know, they do actually make a really big difference. And these folks are willing to pick up the phone and to work with their local colleagues. So it's a low tech answer, but, you know, look and see if your state has a program and go from there.
And another question that I had was, when you do decide you are ready to reach out to your state, and even when you guys were doing research earlier this year, what were the states where you were really surprised and like pleasantly surprised by an innovative program, something that was working that you wish other states knew about?
Ooh. This is a hard one in the best way possible. Honestly, all of them. I mean, which isn't all the states that we highlighted. So our report highlights 9 states. It highlights Maine, and I'm going in geographic order here, folks, because that's the way that I remember it. We looked at Maine, Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Colorado, and California. And we looked at all of these states for really different reasons. You know, you look at a state like West Virginia, and what was neat about West Virginia is that they are, the entire state is fully bought into closing the digital divide. You know, they have mobilized leaders at every level of government. They are working closely with their congressional counterparts. They are working with local providers. They are building the resources that that state needs in order to, you know, get the broadband that they need to compete in today's economy. You know, you look at Maine, and we love the capacity planning or capacity building and local planning initiatives that they have in place there. And I think that a lot of what our research emphasized for us is that, you know, states are implementing programs that work best for them. Every state is different. That doesn't mean that there aren't solutions that states can learn from one another, but we are really seeing states employ or build programs that work best for their communities. And, you know, as you know, me and my team, we are more focused on state policy and local policy. That's what our backgrounds are in. So for us, it was really exciting to kind of see state personalities come through in their responses. I don't know, that didn't really answer your question though.
That's okay. I was just interested in what you might have uncovered in your research.
Yeah.
Do any of the local officials that are on the call have questions for Kathryn? I want to make sure that we create space for that. And if you do, just raise your hand or even unmute yourself and jump in. Okay, great. So we're going to take a timeout from that. Lucas, did you have some notes on NCC?
Yeah, thank you, Francella. So for those of you who don't know, our team has recently expanded at NCC, which is very exciting. And as a result, for the first time, we have some new capacity to really focus in on state and local policy issues and things moving through state legislatures. And I know I'm excited as sort of the person who will be tackling that this summer to really dive into what's going on in the states and be able to provide some more hard resources for all of you in your municipalities to not only get in touch with your state leaders through webinars or calls that we hopefully will set up over the course of the summer, but also by providing you resources to other state level coalitions that are doing some really good work. I recently sat in on and will continue to be sitting in on one group such as the Small Business Resiliency Network, which is made up of a group of economic development officers and other officials from across the states. And they specifically right now are looking for some stories to be included on a podcast platform about what states and local governments are doing to elevate small businesses, specifically getting them connected to what they call the new digital economy that I'm sure all of us are well aware of that's coming in the near future. So if any of you are doing any work right now in your communities that you think should be highlighted by NCC or by this network, please reach out to me. I think almost all of you have seen my email in one place or another. It's just lucas@nextcenturycities.org. And if you have any topics that you really would like NCC to prioritize this summer as we delve into state policy, please do not hesitate to reach out. I am available almost every hour of the day. Francella can tell you I'm up early and stay up late. So if anything pops into your mind at any point, please do not hesitate to reach out through any medium. Thanks.
Thanks, Lucas. And also special thanks to Kathryn just for sharing her thoughts. I don't want her to go anywhere because we are going to have a Q&A at the end, and I do want to create space for people who might have other questions that are stimulated by the next discussion. But now we're going to move on to talking a little bit about the federal policy landscape. Probably, I don't remember the first time that I got to meet Jon. It might have been a few years ago. And I do remember when he was doing research for Vision for 2020s, that report actually featured almost 25 NCC member municipalities. He conducted extensive research across the nation. And one of the things that sticks with me was a day that we did an interview, and Jon was talking about a local leader where he said having broadband come to their community was not going to save it, but not having it was going to ensure its demise. And so I think it's really important when we're talking to policymakers who understand the human impact side of it, just as well as they do the machinations of the policy. So today I'd like to introduce to you Jon Sallet, who has a long and extensive, a resume of working for government with both DOJ and the FCC. Specifically, he has decades of experience on tech and telecom policy, and I'm really pleased that he's able to share his thoughts with us today. So with no further ado, please welcome Jon Sallet from Benton.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the chance to be here with you and with Kathryn. It's a wonderful opportunity. Here's the basic thesis. The question that's in front of us is, what can state and local leaders do to influence federal policy? And I think the most important thing that state and local officials can do is to explain why they're important to the goal of getting broadband to everybody. It sounds silly because anyone who works at a local community knows that state and local leaders are critical to understanding what communities need, what skills they need, what are the unemployment opportunities, what are the employment opportunities, what are the communities that are most in need. But too often at the federal level, broadband is treated as a pure technology problem. How do you deploy a network? That's not the goal. That should not be the goal. The goal should be, and we said this in our Benton report, that everyone in America is able to use high performance broadband. Everybody's able to use it. It's not just about deployment. It's about competition, which brings better quality and lower prices. It's about affordability for low income. It's about digital skills. It's about, of course, community institutions. John Windhausen is among the audience today. John's talked about this a lot, the diverse roles of community institutions. In other words, broadband policy isn't about a technology, it's about the people who use it. And if there's one thing that can be done to influence federal policy, it's for that to be heard, for those voices to be heard. And I think this is a critical time. Here's why. When we wrote our report in October, we said, here's goals for 2030. But that broadband future that we envisioned years out is what we're living right now. We have fast forwarded into the future of broadband. We're all on a webinar. We're not in the same physical room. We're working from home, many of us. Kids are learning from home. We're visiting doctors from home. We're socializing with family and friends from home. That's going to last. Not exactly as it is today, but what happens in a crisis is a crisis changes the trajectory of history. And one of the ways that this trajectory is being changed, once we conquer the terrible health crisis, once we get into the job of restoring economic growth, is that we're going to find, I believe, that broadband will have shaped society in a fundamental way. In other words, the debate about whether broadband is a luxury or an essential connection to society is over. Everybody needs broadband at home to be a full participant in American society and in its economy. Just think about the changes we're seeing. Schools, of course. Last year, only about 30% of the nation's K through 12 schools had the kind of broadband in 2019 that the FCC had said they needed in 2018, running behind 70% of schools. Now 55 million school children are out of school, learning online. It's not necessarily going to end right away. Work. Lots of people working from home. Companies like Twitter and Facebook saying some people may never have to come back to an office. One prediction that by the end of 2021, 25-30% of people will still be working multiple days from home. Doctor's visits, the VA administration putting more emphasis on telehealth. So broadband is an essential pathway to participation. But it's more than that. Think of the economic crises we face now. Really what we have is a long-term structural problem that has been massively compounded by a huge cyclical problem. Here's what I mean. We are in the 40 years of growing income inequality, of challenges to people being able to participate in the economy, of the kind of shared growth that we had seen the decades before. Income inequality was getting worse. Now this hits, and think of how bad it is. Almost 40 million Americans filed unemployment claims in the last 9 weeks. Unemployment, by some predictions, 20% or higher, equaling or close to or maybe above the highest unemployment rate in the Great Depression. But particularly, what we think we know now is that this crisis is impacting low-income people and younger people even worse in terms of the economy. The chairman of the Fed talked about the fact that of families in February making less than $40,000 a year, right? Get that, families in February of this year making less than $40,000, almost 40% of those households lost a job in just the month of March. And young people, there's a piece in the Washington Post today, a previous one in the New York Times, not surprisingly, people who haven't yet, who are just trying to enter the job market, are most disadvantaged. The Washington Post piece tells us that among millennials, there was greater job loss this spring than either their younger counterparts, Generation Z, or the older baby boomers. This means broadband policy has to deliver increased economic opportunity. And again, that goes to local communities. What are the kind of jobs that need to be created in local communities? So a long-term economic strategy, and by this I mean the stimulus bills we've had are absolutely critical, but they're not necessarily enough. A long-term economic strategy should include infrastructure, and it should include broadband. It should include broadband in all of its aspects: deployment, competition, usage, community institutions. Think about the relationship between the federal and the state governments right now. The federal government can borrow money and can spend money. And that's what the stimulus bills do. State and local governments are feeling the crunch. So we have a situation where the resources may need to come from the federal government, but the leadership in fundamental ways needs to come from state and local governments. Kathryn has talked about this, and everything she says is exactly right. But there's more to it, I think, that illustrates what she's saying. We need to explain to federal policymakers why state and local leadership is important. I think it's because, and this is because of what we've heard from people like you all, successful broadband has to take account of the different local circumstances, the political environment, how much public support there are for different solutions, the states and local resource levels, geography, economic conditions. And so we see different solutions in different places. Some places where middle mile networks have played a very important role. Other places where rural telcos have helped deployment. In rural areas, rural electric co-ops. Different kinds of public-private partnerships so that municipalities can shape their own future. This is important. There isn't a one-size-fits-all, as we hear it from you all. There's different ways of proceeding. Sometimes a municipality can be the last mile provider. Sometimes it works in partnerships. But we need to have municipalities have the freedom to experiment and learn. The other thing we hear from people is that a fundamental advantage of state and local leadership is that it's close to the people who need to be served. And this is particularly important, I think, when it comes to affordability. Again, what I said before, there's a tendency to sometimes think about broadband policy as if it's only about technology. But there will be people who cannot afford fixed broadband at home. And yet it's become, I said this before, a critical pathway to participation. It's one of the reasons that the Benton Institute has recently endorsed the creation of a broadband credit, America's broadband credit, to make sure that people low income, I'm sorry, my dog is very excited, but not necessarily at that Benton proposal. I just want to be plain. Low income people and almost 40 million people on unemployment need to be able to keep the access to society that broadband provides. And they ought to be able to do it in a way that serves competition by getting credits that they can use with the broadband provider of their choice. This is a way to make sure that a new digital divide doesn't open. We already have so many. We have digital divides between rural and urban. We have had a digital divide between those people who earn more and those people who earn less. We've had digital divides between people who are in places where multiple networks were deployed, and then some parts of a city where they are not. All of this adds up. Tom Wheeler, who's the former chairman of the FCC, for whom I had the chance to work, has a piece out in Brookings today, and he quotes what we're saying about all these digital divides adding up to a digital chasm. That's bad. We have got to take on the job of economic recovery, and we've got to solve each one of the digital divides so we don't end up in a digital chasm that becomes a societal chasm and an economic chasm. So what can state and local officials do? I think what they can do is explain to federal policymakers the role they play in bringing together communities, bringing together resources, bringing together strategies to make sure that everyone can get broadband. Here's an example from my home in Arlington, Virginia. During this crisis, Arlington, which was already providing technology to 28,000 students, and every September you'd see the new middle schoolers very cutely with their new iPads carrying them around town. During this crisis, identified 1,000 families without connectivity, allocated $500,000 of federal stimulus money to helping people get connectivity, provided hotspots to almost 900 homes. Okay, that's an example. You are all living other examples. Here's one thing that we'd like to do, and let me talk about our work for a minute at Benton, because I think we can help amplify and tell this story. Last October, we issued this big report on national broadband, thinking we had till 2030. This October, it was always our plan to issue a revised set of recommendations. Well, the world has changed in that year. So obviously, we want to react to that change. A really important understanding is what do you see in local communities about how you think broadband usage is going to be changed? What are you hearing from different groups? Seniors who may feel they have to spend more time at home even after the health crisis has passed. Workers who may need more broadband at home. And by the way, just to make one technological point, we have for years emphasized download speeds. We're on a symmetrical application right now. 3 of us in one household on one connection using this application would be using more bandwidth than is the minimum upstream speed the FCC considered broadband. Right, 3 megs. There are video applications that by themselves are more than 3 megs, not to count multiple usage. So we need to be able to talk about these issues, and a local community leader will understand it. To come back to my point, Francella has very graciously said that we can send you all an email after this. What we're interested in, what we'd love to hear from you about, would contribute to our report, we'd be able to recognize local efforts and the work of NCC, is when you're talking to different user communities, workers, senior citizens, people doing telehealth, what are you hearing from them that gives you a sense of what the future of broadband usage is going to be? And how do you see that? Ben, you can come up if you want. We are going to have a dog appearance, I think, in a minute. What do you see already that how broadband can be improved by local leadership? Any stories you have, any statistics you have, Anything you want us to know will be used by us, will be helpful, because just to conclude, the way to influence federal policy is for your voices to be heard, for your stories to be told, and more than anything else, for your expertise to be engaged. It's important, and we're happy to help. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, John. And so before we open up the floor to some questions, I did want to probe you on a couple of things that you brought up, which were very interesting. But first, I want to bring up a question that surfaced in the chat. One of the questions was about if there was any, if you were aware of any, excuse me, the question from Arif, Open Fiber, do you or anyone have any case studies in which cities and municipalities were influenced to dismantle their close partnerships with big ISPs in order to better meet their residents' needs through locally owned service? Did you have any insights on that?
Sure. In our report, we talk about a couple of places, one in Ohio, one in Idaho. So let's set up the common context. Communities perhaps are served by one provider, typically a cable provider. They want more. And they don't have anybody else who will come in. This is the story, for example, in Alexandria, Virginia. And so in a couple of places, what local governments have done is to build fiber to the home. And that can operate in a couple of different ways. It can operate as Chattanooga, Tennessee does, where the municipality is the provider of the service. Mm-hmm. It can also provide an open access pathway, and this is the story of AIM in Idaho, which connected fiber to homes, is connecting fiber to homes, and then opens that up to allow any ISP to deliver the service so that a household pays for the fiber connection to the city, but the city isn't the retail provider. It's an ISP that comes over it. And of course, that open access provides competition. Last tactic we've seen, South Bend, Indiana is an example. Peggy knows about this from open access in Maine, is open access middle miles, which don't go all the way to the residences, but because they are open, dramatically cut the cost of reaching homes, and therefore can also incentivize deployment and competition.
Got it. And I am just actually tapping. Oh, Kathryn, please chime in here. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. So I would like to flag that John and I do debate about this issue of competition. And he may be laughing to himself or grimacing. I can't really tell right now. But
it's generally hard for people to tell that about me, Kathryn. So
fair enough. So I think that where competition makes sense, that's wonderful. You know, free market capitalism, et cetera, drives prices down, great. But in some cases, states are often dealing with communities that are so remote, they are so unserved that, you know, just getting one provider in the door is a win. Okay. And hopefully that comes with affordable access and good service. But what we found from the research is that it's about having tools in the toolbox. So for the cities and localities where, you know, you have your Chattanoogas, your Arlingtons, where the open access makes sense, that's great. For your cities and communities where rural electric co-ops, where there's a good footprint of those that exist in the state and you can use those, that's great. The goal is to help elevate models that are working across the country. So then localities can pick what works best for them and what's allowable within existing state policy. I think the point from our perspective, Pew's perspective, is that there isn't one right way to do this, one correct way to do this. It is about finding what is going to work best for your locality, for your residents, and also that accounts for the capacity and expertise that's within local government and what your local government can actually afford to do.
Yeah, Kathryn, I'm not aware of us disagreeing. We're very plain in our report.
Yeah.
Deployment is critical. It's got to be everywhere. But here's the history of telecom regulation in the last century. We have systematically made the mistake of assuming there couldn't be competition where there could be. We should get broadband to everybody. We should promote competition so that it's not ruled out of bounds by some a priori view of what people want, but it's decided by what the local circumstances can actually provide. And we ought to test different propositions around openness to see what promotes sustainable deployment and competition.
Jon, I just want to pause right here and create space for Peggy Schaefer to weigh in. I know that she's writing feverishly in the chat. Peggy Schaefer's from Maine. And then after that, tapping Perry Mulcrone, who just dropped a note in the chat about Scott County, Minnesota. So we'll start with Peggy. If you will unmute yourself, that would be great.
So hopefully you won't hear my husband mowing. So maybe I should close it. So first off, I would say all of this sort of built, my larger point here on much of this is that I find the federal money a hard match for communities. And the USDA process is among the most bureaucratic I have ever experienced in my life. And I've been a bureaucrat for 35 years. So it gives me great examples of what not to do with money. And I also think that the FCC process is also very difficult for ISPs and communities to involve in. And that goes back to 2 points that Jon made. One is the point of the infrastructure is not to build it, it's to use it. And none of those federal programs have any vision of anyone ever using it. And so my stance is that this next round of infrastructure funding should come in block grants to the states for the very reasons that Jon talked about. Most states have a grant program in place and a plan. Many of us have either have a planning process that we've had in place or are quickly building them. Most of us have some requirement of digital literacy and digital inclusion in our application plans. So the infrastructure is the how, but the use is the why, and the states are the best ones to make sure that money gets out and gets used in a way that actually builds economies. And I think that the whole conversation around open access, not open access is, it's an interesting conversation once we get to that point, but we got to build this stuff first. And the only way we're going to build it, because the price tag is immense, is to do it with the assistance of federal funds. I will also say that your state funds can do the infamous capital stack, which is very difficult to do with the federal funds. We can layer in state money, federal money, local money, and loan money and other money to make a project work. And that is going to differ based on the area. And it's going to need a lot of that local support to figure out that model and how this is going to work. We have several municipally owned open access systems in Maine. So far, we only have one provider on each of them. And that is, it's a matter of density. We have, a lot of distance and not a lot of density. But I think until you get take rates that hit 60 and 70%, or 50, at least 50%, no other provider is going to come in. I think competition is important, but this whole piece about how we get people to use it is what's going to drive competition in these open access systems. And that is really only going to, the federal systems are not, this federal funding is not designed to create any of either competition or use. And that's why the money, I think, has to come to the states first.
Thank you for sharing that, Peggy. And I do want to tap Perry Mulcrone. If you want to share anything, I want to make sure that you have room to do that.
Yeah, hi. I'm Perry from Scott County. I'm a business relationship director. I don't know if you can see me, but so Scott County, we installed initially it was just an institutional fiber network, and we leveraged emergency management funds for our 800 megahertz radios that connect our towers. And so I won't go into the whole depth of the story, but we then realized we could start leveraging that fiber for other things to help our partners. And we connected our cities, and we connected all the PDs and the school districts. And so all the institutions are connected. And then we started leveraging it for economic development. And now we're really trying to work hard to get it to close the digital divide between rural Scott County and the urban northern half of Scott County. So one thing that Lucas, I was going to email you on is that maybe a different time we could talk about. We spent the past 5 weeks of quickly bringing fixed wireless to the rural areas in a private-public partnership. We did a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 funding from the county, 1/3 from a fixed wireless provider, and 1/3 from the local municipalities like the townships and the school districts. And we were able to raise $315,000 to get that quickly and within 4 weeks, symmetrical speeds to the rural areas of 100 megs up and down with very little latency because it jumps right from a tower onto our backbone fiber. So I guess just reading some of these comments is you don't have to assume an ISP has to build the networks. You can do all different kinds of models. There are different kind of funds. I agree with Peggy right before my comments is that we can get these things built in different ways, and fixed wireless is an example where we allowed a open access over our dark fiber, but the fixed wireless provider could very quickly bring very fast speeds when people are waiting for fiber to the home. And I think together they work really well in different communities. And I hope that helps anybody on the call.
Yeah, it helps a lot. It's really important, and it speaks to the point that both Kathryn and I have made about local conditions helping to shape successful broadband strategy to get broadband to people who otherwise wouldn't have it.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I also want to we have a couple of local officials that are on the line. I see Aldona Vellicenti, David Keys from Seattle. I know that a couple of you are there. If you want to share anything, I do want to make sure that you have the opportunity to do so. So please do just unmute yourself and chime in if you want to share anything. Okay, so, oh, hi, Aldona. I just want to make sure.
I wanted to share just a couple of things because the story is pretty long, but I have spent 5 years now doing two things, 2.5 studying, 2.5 overseeing implementation. Lexington, Fayette County, mostly the city, now has passed 100,000 homes fiber to the home with gigabit speeds. And anybody actually can use it and sign up. So there was no fiberhood model. But the 2.5 years spent in studying, I think we've now come up with certain criteria. It's very important if you have a utility, it's easier. If you don't have a utility, it's harder. The funding models are almost endless. Everything from a public-private partnership to bonding. And bonding for a city our size is extremely important. If you bonded that, you could not bond anything else without losing a couple of points on how you would be rated by one of the bonding companies. The density is very important. The denser, the better. Not so dense, not very good. And that's why all the rurals are struggling. The history, and this is, I'll just call upon my own history. I worked at the state level. I managed the Kentucky Information Highway for 6 years, which was a consortium of 19 telecom companies providing some sort of connectivity to every county, every school in 120 counties in Kentucky. That has now emerged as Kentucky Wired, which is the middle mile, and that in itself is also one. But all of this is possible, but I'll tell you, you need an awful lot of dedication and an awful lot of time. Federal funding for the city was never an option, and frankly, is not even an option for the county part because of the way that the rules are written, because of the way that you have to prove, the way that the studies are done, the way the deployment is already done. There is an awful lot to correct. At some point, I'll be happy to have a longer conversation with any one of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aldona, for sharing that. And are there any other local officials that wanted to make sure that they got to speak up for their community? Okay. Thank you so much, John, for your presentation. Ryan, do you want to? You have to unmute yourself, Ryan.
Oh, sorry. Good afternoon, everyone, again. And I want to thank Jon for explaining kind of what issues federal policymakers are focused on today. Originally, my comments were going to explain kind of how our members can help influence policy at the federal level, but I think Jon did that better than I ever could. So what I want to focus on is how NCC can be a resource for local leaders to kind of get their voices heard at the central level, or at the federal level, sorry. Our central commitment is to elevating our members' voices. And we want to ensure that policymakers kind of understand the local impact of their policy proposals. And that being said, it's not just about what we're doing here as a small 5-man team, but it's about what we can do to help, really. Recently, we've been working on issues to file comments on things like the Lifeline program and poll attachments and competition in the telecom marketplace. But what we really need is to hear from our members. Being able to share those stories and statements directly from local officials highlights just how important these issues are, and it really makes them that much harder to ignore. Additionally, we've been working very hard to tell these stories directly to policymakers. We're happy to help members tell stories directly to the Federal Communications Commission, to commissioners' offices, their staff, and we've also been working very hard to be able to bring these stories to the halls of Congress. We've created opportunities all over the place, and we're excited to continue to do that work. It's imperative, I think, that we continue to challenge the rhetoric that's often used to declare that everything's fine and the digital divide is closing. And I think local officials really do have, as has been stated before, that they can see how connectivity solutions affect their communities the best. Their stories and their community experiences, and often the hard data that follows that, helps quantify otherwise qualitative stories that really, I think, hit home a little bit harder with policymakers. And we hope that we can be a resource to help tell them stories more in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Ryan. And I do know there are like a couple more things that are coming in the chat, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time and make sure that I wrap up a couple of notes for you. One of the things that I thought was really important that Jon brought up is that resources might come from the federal government, but that leadership needs to come from state and local levels. And we couldn't agree more. Our job here is to make sure that we are giving local officials a platform to actually participate in the policy discussions at every level of government. And we don't take it for granted that the human impact stories, the community impact stories, those are the stories that really help enrich making for good policy at every level of government. From here, I want to encourage anyone who's interested in getting more information, number one, about Kathryn de Wit's work with the state broadband initiatives. It's available on Pew Charitable Trusts. It was also dropped in the chat. For Jon Sallet, he is a senior fellow at Benton. His report, Vision for 2020s, is widely available, and I'm sure most of you have reviewed it, but we also dropped his information in the chat. And as for Next Century Cities information, our recent filings, our articles, all of those things are available on our nextcenturycities.org website. What we're asking from you from here is to make sure for local officials, use us as a resource. Share your stories, share your statements, share your quotes, tell us where you agree and where you don't agree, because one thing that we can do is make sure that we elevate those things onto the docket and create platforms where you get to tell your stories in your own words. From our team, specifically Ryan and Lucas, who actually spoke on this call, Brittany, Ray, and Abby, who weren't on this call but are very much a part of our work, and me, Francella, I'm just so thankful that you guys are a part of our community and encourage you to keep having conversations like this with or without us. So again, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, and all of our contact information is available on nextcenturycities.org. Thanks, you guys. Have a beautiful day.